See, all good things must come to an end. Mr. Gordon's talk has come to an end, and our first day's proceedings of this conference are also coming to an end. We now come to the last speaker of the day. The last speaker of the day is Mr. Harsh Vardhan. Although I have never met him, I've heard so much of his passion for steam locomotives and his knowledge of steam locomotives that I feel I've known him forever. Professionally an engineer and project manager, Harsh Vardhan is first a steam railway enthusiast interested in steam heritage and steam preservation. Born in India, he migrated to Canada and is a Canadian national and overseas citizen of India today. That is since the last 13-14 years. Starting as a member of the Friends of National Rail Museum Society in India in the late 1990s, he was one of the founder members of the Indian Steam Railway Society and active in setting it up. He has written extensively on the steam scene in India and the need for preservation of this important and significant heritage. Familiar with rail museums in India and Canada, he is in an excellent position to give the Indian audience a very good account of the museums in Canada. Mr. Harsh Vardhan is now based in Toronto. Toronto is the financial capital of Canada and an access for its railway operations. Much of the east-west transcontinental railway traffic passes through here. In the early 20th century, two major railroads, the Canadian Pacific and the Canadian National, were vying for the lion's share of this traffic, and to meet with the ever-growing demand, built their respective roundhouses near Toronto Union Station between 1928 and 1931. With the demise of steam and after serving for almost 40 years, both roundhouses faced redundancy and demolition to make way for redevelopment as they are on prime real estate. A very different fate, however, awaited them, as one was demolished to build one landmark, while the other barely survived and has stayed in the shadow of another Toronto landmark ever since. Harsh will tell us the story of Toronto John Street Roundhouse, which is now home to one of the youngest railway museums in the world. Over to you, Harsh. Harsh, I hope you are there. I did see you.
Thank you, Mr. Singh. I hope you're able to hear me.
Yeah,
Thank you for the very kind introduction. Yes, it's been rather unfortunate that we have not been able to meet all these years.
Yes.
But I'm sure there will be a day soon. So my name is Harsh Vardhan, and I'd like to thank you all for your time and interest. I would also like to express my thanks and gratitude to the Railway Enthusiast Societies, the organizers of this conference, as well as the moderators for these talks. Unfortunately, due to the time difference, I have not been able to enjoy these and other talks that have been organized by Rail Enthusiast Society, but one day I hope to. Before I begin my talk today, I just wanted to give you a brief introduction for those of you who may not know me very well personally, as this would also provide an insight into the importance of museums and the role they played in furthering my rail fanning interest. I belong to a clan of men and women who call themselves railway enthusiasts or simply rail fans. For as long as I can remember, I have been interested in the fascinating world of railways. As a child, I would be fervently praying when coming across a railway crossing that the gates be closed, just so I can get a glimpse of the train. My imaginative play always included a train. My parents were avid travelers, and with trains being the only way one could travel any considerable distance in those days, I got to do a plenty of early railway travel just getting from A to B. I lived at New Delhi throughout my time in India, and in early 1977, I was exposed to an entire new world with the opening of the Rail Transport Museum. I will start sharing my screen now. Let me know if there is an issue.
Go ahead.
I recall attending the inaugural day of the museum on a sunny February 1st with my father, just as he would take me to different places to experience anything new. It could be a train, a bridge, a building being inaugurated. And from him, I have developed interest in all these things. In the early days of the museum, there were only a handful of exhibits, but this was one of the few museums that we had in Delhi, or I would say anywhere in India, that were dedicated to trains. It exposed me to the hitherto unknown world of railways, its history, nuances, and operations, all of which have impressed me ever since, or as some might say, have taken over my life. In 1979, while walking back from school at a customary railway train watching stop at Delhi Cantonment railway station, which used to be on my way, I met an English couple who, to my utmost surprise, were interested in trains just like me. They were part of a tour group traveling across India in search of the remaining relics of the British Raj. We started talking out of mutual curiosity and somehow struck a chord and have remained friends ever since. Through them, I became aware of the universal world of interest in train spotting, of books and magazines devoted to this hobby that would probably be ignored as ludicrous in India at that time. For the longest time, they were my solace that I'm not peculiar or unique in my excitement for trains. My friends and family had known about this strange affliction of mine, but it was generally dismissed as a phase that I would outgrow from. For many years in my youth, I lived across Lodi Colony railway station, which was part of Delhi Circular Railway, also known as the Parikrama Seva in those days. And it was a ritual to take any of visitors to our home for a quick hour, 20 minutes spin on the circular service, with a customary stopover at New Delhi for chai pakoras. It was the best Delhi darshan you could get in those days. And believe me, there was no filth or stench besides the track, nor people living right up to it in those days. Steam locomotives have always held a special place in my heart. And at that time, I imagined they would be around forever. Never in my wildest imagination could I have imagined that they would disappear so suddenly. There were just that many. The reality that the end is inevitable struck me in 1993 as I witnessed a huge lineup of broad gauge WP studs from Jhansi Shed that once ruled those tracks, stabled in a decrepit condition at Dholpur for a mass scrap auction. I wrote to the Railway Board and Delhi Museum about retaining some in working order, but got nowhere, not even an acknowledgement or a courtesy of a reply. The museum had always been a part of my life that I visited regularly, took my friends, nephew, and nieces, and always made sure to make an entry in their visitor books, just as my father used to do at every place that had one. In the final years of broad gauge steam, I once again petitioned to the powers that be about retaining some WP class locomotive for service for the posterity. Again, no replies. This time, however, I learned through my contacts that a couple of WPs had been earmarked for preservation and possibly even to operate the new and now broad gauge palace on wheels. Another few years went by and I was passing through Haridwar for a whitewater rafting trip at Rishikesh when I got a glimpse of what I thought was a WP locomotive lurking outside the former Haridwar steam loco trip shed. On my return, I kept some time to explore, and I was aghast at the sight of WP 7015 and WP 7161, formerly belonging to Moradabad shed of Northern Railway, that were just dumped there and exposed to the elements. On my return, I spoke with the contacts in media about running a story of this neglect, but I just could not get them to understand what was so precious about a couple of rusting old locomotives. On my next visit to the museum, I put some scathing comments in the visitors' books, perhaps just to vent. But this time, something that had not happened in the previous 19 years happened. I got a call from the museum director's assistant after a few days, and I was told that he wished to see me. It was Ashwini Lohani, and he was already working on reviving Fairy Queen at the time. We had a long conversation. About the importance of involving common person in the heritage preservation movement. We talked about heritage preservation movement overseas and how it works. He had recently been to the York Museum. And out of these talks, the Friends of National Rail Museum Society was born, which later transformed into Indian Steam Railway Society. It may be difficult to believe now, but in those pre-internet days, I had to look high and low, write a dozen of letters, and even travel across the country just to be able to find 10 fellow railway enthusiasts to join us. Don't get me wrong. It was very worthwhile, and I forged lifelong bonds and friendship with the folks I met at that time. Some of these people I have still remained in touch with. They are part of the Railway Enthusiast Society. And I would like to name Viraf Mullah, who I traveled to Bombay to meet in those days, Joydeep Datta, also Bharat Vora, who will be presenting tomorrow. It was a good couple of years with the Steam Railway Society. But in 2001, I was faced with a dilemma when I had an opportunity to migrate to Canada. And it was perhaps one of the toughest decisions I had to take, to part with a society that I was involved with from its conception. Even before I actually moved, I was looking for like-minded folks in Toronto, which was going to be my new home. And it was then that I came across the just formed Toronto Railway Historical Association. They had banded together in an effort to create a railway museum in a former roundhouse, which was little more than a dump at the time, in the heart of downtown Toronto. Now moving on to the other side of the world. Canada is the second largest country in the world with one of the lowest population density. A vast majority of the people live in 100 kilometers of the US-Canada border, and rest is mostly wilderness. Yet the northern part of Canada is rich in its natural resources that need to be shipped from the source to large cities or to shipping ports. Before Canada came about as a confederation in 1867, provinces or states existed as separate British colonies. And this map will show you as it was before Canada was formed in 1867. And it was called as British North America. Several United States provinces were also part of the British North America. Bringing them together as one country was a challenge that could only be overcome by a transcontinental railroad. And that's exactly what Canada's founding father pushed forward. Canadian Pacific Railway completed the first major transcontinental stretch from Montreal to Vancouver in 1885, fulfilling a condition of British Columbia's 1871 entry into the Canadian Confederation. By 1889, CPR had connected the railway with the Atlantic coast, making it the first truly coast-to-coast railway. Canadian National Railway came after in 1919 after Government of Canada stepped in to combine several bankrupt and dysfunctional companies into one. Canadian National operated much like a public enterprise until 1978. With its operations subsidized by the Canadian government, it operated from coast to coast and soon overtook Canadian Pacific to become the largest rail operator in Canada, both by revenue and size. So this map will broadly show the railway operations in Canada. Again, as I said, it's mostly concentrated along the south border with the United States. It doesn't seem like much, but due to the distances, I believe it's about 50,000 kilometers of route length. Most of it is freight operation. Via rail exists since 1978 for the passenger services, which were earlier taken by several railroads, including Canadian National and Canadian Pacific. In the aftermath of First World War in the 1920s, due to a surge in passenger and freight traffic, both railways expanded their operations substantially. In downtown Toronto, Canadian Pacific built a brand new Union Station in 1927. The picture that you are looking at is actually the older or the second Union Station. The current is the third Union Station. They were all located in similar vicinity. As you can see, it was very close to Lake Ontario. A lot of land has further south, which is on the right of this picture, has been reclaimed and high rises have been built since. But this is the view before the third Union Station was built in 1927. So this is the view from the tower looking east, and you can see the new or the third Union Station being constructed. And this is the view looking west. These are from 1926. As I was saying, in downtown Toronto, Canadian Pacific built a new Union Station in 1927 and a huge hotel called Royal York right across from it in 1929. It was a benchmark for luxury and the tallest structure in the city at the time. This is a picture of the Royal York Hotel being built. It was completed in 1929. And as you can imagine, how much the railway was involved in passenger traffic at the time. This is the view of the opening of the Union Station in 1927, and in the backdrop, you can see the Royal York Hotel. This is a poster for the Royal York Toronto Hotel, which was run by Canadian Pacific at the time, the largest hotel in the British Empire. Another poster from the time, Canadian Pacific. As you can see, they used to build these structures not just to attract the passenger, but also to make a statement about their strength. Another advertisement of the Royal York Toronto Hotel. I'd like you to take a look at the hotel rooming rates, $4 a day. This is a view from the waterfront. This is the Royal York Hotel, the Union Station in its shadow. This building called Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce was built in 1937. So for 2 years, the Royal York was the tallest building in Toronto. This is the Harbor Commission's office. And an interesting thing you will see is the steamships that were being operated at the time by Canadian Steamship Lines. The two major mode of transportation in those days are visible here. But it was not just stations and hotels. You also need motive power. to drive the passenger and steam trains as passenger and freight trains. Canadian Pacific built a 9,300 square meter roundhouse between 1925 and 1931, and it became known as John Street Roundhouse due to the name of the street that was next to it. In this picture, looking south towards United States or Lake Ontario, this is the Canadian Pacific John Street Roundhouse. And this is the Canadian National Spadina Roundhouse, which I will be talking about in a few minutes. The roundhouse had stalls for 32 locomotives that were moved in and out of a structure on a massive 120-foot rotating turntable designed by a Canadian Bridge Company. How big is a 120-foot turntable? Well, it's the largest that used to exist. And as you can see in this picture, which is from another roundhouse in Montreal, it could accommodate 2 full-size locomotives. But in those days, the steam locomotives, they had a tender as well, and some of them, they needed the 120-foot turntable. Every day, John Street locomotives hauled over 40 CPR or Canadian Pacific Railway passenger trains in and out of Toronto Union Station. Some of them would pull local commuter trains to Hamilton or Peterborough, which are suburbs of Toronto. Others would haul a quarter-mile long trains in the initial portion of their journeys to destination as far as Montreal, Vancouver, Winnipeg, Detroit, Chicago, and New York City. This is a picture taken much later, around 1960s, when another high-rise called Toronto Dominion Centre was being built. It shows the Royal York Hotel as well as Canadian Pacific John Street Roundhouse. For over 30 years, the roundhouse was used to service CPR steam locomotives. When the company retired steam engines in 1960, John Street continued to service CPR and via rail diesel electric locomotives for another 20 years until 1986, after which CPR decided to close the facility and donate it to the City of Toronto for a possible use as a railway museum in future. There are another few views of the John Street Roundhouse. The first color picture, again showing both roundhouses, the CP John Street and the Spadina Roundhouse belonging to Canadian National. In its prime, John Street facility contained 43 structures, several miles of tracks, covering nearly 16 acres of property, and up to 150 men worked on the facility 24 hours a day. The locomotives serviced here were so attractively maintained that their appearance became known amongst the railroaders as John Street polish. For over 30 years, the roundhouse was used to service CPR steam locomotives. This is the view when a highway was built in the 1950s further south between Lake Ontario and the John Street Roundhouse. It's known as a Gardiner Expressway. The Canadian National Railway built the Spadina Roundhouse. It was built in 1928 by Angeline Norcross of Montreal. It was also equipped with a 120-foot turntable. The purpose of Spadina Roundhouse was a pre-trip inspection, servicing, and repairing of motive power for passenger trains, including steam locomotives and later Bud Rail diesel rail cars for the trains originating or terminating at Toronto Union Station. In October 1970, at the end of the North American tour, the famous steam locomotive Flying Scotsman number 4472 was stored at the Roundhouse to wait out the winter at the end of its North American tour. As you can see, the Flying Scotsman here with Canadian National steam locomotives, diesel locomotives, and the super train. At the end of the steam era, both locomotive roundhouses continued to serve as a repair and maintenance facility for diesel locomotive rail cars and passenger coaches. This was the last Canadian National train out of Union Station. Canadian Pacific ended their steam operations in 1960, but Canadian National continued for some time afterwards. In 1968, when Canadian National Railways wanted to build a large television and radio communication platform to serve the Toronto area and demonstrate the strength of Canadian industry, the CN Rail in particular. As you can imagine, it was a large redevelopment project on railway lands, but somehow both roundhouses escaped demolition and continued to operate in some capacity. As you can see in this picture, in the middle, it's a CN Tower being built at the time in 1973, which was nearly same distance from both roundhouses. And it's a surprise that none of the roundhouses were demolished to build it. The next few pictures will show the CN Tower under construction. This is a view looking north towards downtown Toronto with the high rises by this time in 1970s. The Union Station below it, the Royal York. The CPR roundhouses at the bottom right corner of the picture. This picture is not particularly of railway interest, but this is the helicopter putting the top during the construction of the CN Tower in 1973. And this is Canadian Snowbird aircraft, which fly every summer at end of the Canadian National Exhibition. You can see this in 1975, the CN Tower has been completed. You still see the railway lines and the Union Station, the Royal York Hotel. In 1983, there was a renewed impetus into building a world-class outdoor stadium with retractable roof to be used for baseball and American Football League games, and also possibly for a future Olympic bid by Toronto. Government of Ontario considered several proposals and potential sites, but the railway lands next to the Union Station and CN Tower won due to proximity with a major transit hub. Yes, the Union Station. As a result, the Spadina Roundhouse was demolished in 1986, and Sky Dome, now known as Rogers Centre, was built in its place. This is a picture of the Sky Dome being built. It had an interesting story when they ran a contest to name this new stadium. And a member of the public who suggested Sky Dome won lifetime membership or tickets to any events that will be held here in future. This is the picture of the Sky Dome being completed. It's now called as Rogers Centre for the past few years. For the second time in a span of less than 15 years, the CP John Street Roundhouse had survived the axe. However, things were not all rosy for it. It was getting overrun by weeds, and the structure was increasingly falling apart after 1990 under the ownership of City of Toronto. There were several railway relics left inside the stalls, which were in poor state. Some were moved away to other locations, when the initial promise of turning the roundhouse into a railway museum did not come through fast enough. As you can see in this picture from 1992, the coaling tower, the water tower is still there. You can see the turntable and some other structure, but it's not in any kind of it's in a state of neglect, and it's been cordoned off. Here are some pictures of what the roundhouse looked like inside in those days. This is one of the streetcars from Toronto Transit Commission, which was stored here. But after a few years, it was shipped to Expo Rail in Montreal. Last night or your morning, I heard Matthew Cotier speaking about it. That's where it is right now. Although the John Street Roundhouse was designated a National Historic Site of Canada in 1990, and the roundhouse and its associated structures were first protected under the Ontario Heritage Act, passed in 1996, not much happened in the years following towards the promise of turning it into a railway museum. The coaling tower and water tanks were the auxiliary structures still located in the vicinity of the roundhouse from the working days of the John Street Roundhouse. In 1995, 1/3 or about 14 stalls of the original roundhouse structures were dismantled to allow construction for Metro Toronto Convention Centre. A part of the Convention Centre structure is below the existing roundhouse, and for its construction, they had to dismantle these 14 stalls. But after the construction of the Convention Centre, they were reconstructed and then became part of a brewery named Steam Whistle Brewing. So this company occupies 14 stalls since 2000. This may be seen as a bit of a controversial move, but this renewed the interest in the roundhouse. And following this move, there was private money that started pouring in. And the construction of Metro Toronto Convention Centre also covered the restoration or renovation of the roundhouse in the late 1990s. The area surrounding it became known as a city-owned park. It's called Roundhouse Park since 1997. As a part of this reconstruction, the turntable was also removed and it was stored elsewhere. I moved to Toronto in 2001, and since that time, I have been associated with Toronto Railway Historical Association, whose sole aim at the time was to form the Railway Museum. I was fortunate to work in a high-rise quite next to Union Station from 2003 to 2005, and these pictures are from those days. As you can see, the Sky Dome, the CN Tower, the roundhouse with the turntable removed. And basically covered off so no one falls in the pit. The Toronto Railway Historical Association was established in 2001 and is now incorporated as a federal registered charity. Its primary focus is the development of Toronto Railway Museum. After several years of tireless work and negotiations by TRHA volunteers, the Toronto Railway Museum officially opened on May 28, 2010. This picture is Soon after, it was reopened. The museum operates year-round. It's in the middle part of the roundhouse. This section is still occupied by the Steam Whistle Brewery, and this was used for private redevelopment, not redevelopment, but another tenant in the roundhouse was used to be a mattress company at the time called Leon, and now it's a recreation house built by Cineplex. The museum operates year-round from John Street Roundhouse. It features an indoor gallery, an indoor restoration facility, a full-size diesel cab simulator, an outdoor miniature railway, numerous railway engines and rolling stock, as well as a fully restored railway village, which includes Dawn Station, a watchman's shanty, a water tower, and a coaling tower. Signal Cabin D with tool shed has also been moved to Roundhouse Park. This signal cabin was part of Toronto City's collection of historic buildings, but it was located elsewhere, so it was moved. Also, Dawn Station, which used to be part of Canadian National, besides Dawn River, it was earlier moved to a different location, and it has been moved to the Roundhouse Park. All have restored to its original structural shape. The turntable and the courtyard, the roundhouse with its restored wooden railway were also restored and have received a number of design awards. In 2001 British production, the Railway Children chose the Roundhouse as their site for the outdoor play, which ran for several months in summer of 2011, and it was a huge hit. They had a replica steam locomotive placed on the turntable with special sound and light effect and used to move forward and backward. The star attraction of the museum is the Canadian National 6213. It's a U2G 484 locomotive built by Montreal Locomotive Works in 1942. It may sound slightly ironic that the only steam locomotives at the former Canadian Pacific Roundhouse is a Canadian National, but it was not always at the Roundhouse. For the longest time, it used to sit at Canadian National Exhibition Place next to the Marine Museum. And as a part of the museum construction, this locomotive was also relocated at the Roundhouse. These are some of the other exhibits. A Canadian Pacific 7020 class DS10-B. It's an Alco S2 built in 1944. Also Canadian National Railway number 4803, a GP7 built by General Motors in 1953. Canadian National Caboose. This is the part of the Roundhouse Park I was saying. It has some original structures which were originally located elsewhere. Cabin D, it was moved twice, piece by piece, and still in its original shape. Also Dawn Station. This is an actual full-size railway station that used to exist till 1969, belonging to Canadian National, and it has been moved here. There's a miniature railway at the Roundhouse Park, and this structure is now open to public, and it sells tickets for the miniature railway when it's in operation. There's a picture of the miniature railway. These are, so for those of you who are not familiar, these are the baggage carts which were used mostly in steam days for carrying passenger baggages to the train. This is the replica water tower for the miniature railway. The Dawn Station was built in 1896 by Canadian Pacific Railway and was originally located at Dawn River and Queen Street East, along the western bank of the river. In 1969, it was moved to Todmorden Mills. For many years, while it was there, the station was boarded up and not open to public. Upon its relocation to the Roundhouse Park, it was repainted and repaired and open to public to purchase tickets for the Roundhouse Park Miniature Railway. The Toronto Railway Museum Miniature Railways opened in 2010. Within the Roundhouse Park provides rights to the visitors of the museum in season. The ride has four cars carrying 4 passengers each, a caboose with either towed by a replica steam locomotive and tender or a replica CLC diesel electric Whitcomb center cab switcher. And this is a drone view of the Roundhouse in its early days of operation. As you can see, the CN6213 is on the turntable, and you can see several other exhibits. And that brings me to the end of this presentation. If there are any questions, I'm happy to take. I think you're muted, Mr. Singh.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you, yes, sir.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much. And as I was saying, most of us do have some idea of railway operations in the UK and perhaps the USA, but we know very little about the railways in Canada. Yes, we are aware that there is a CPR and a CNR, but over and above that, we know very little. So this was not only a good lesson on the Roundhouse and how it was renovated and brought back to life, but also on the railway system in Canada.
Thank you. I did not want to go too deep into the operations. The Canadian National is one of the largest companies in North America. It also operates both Canadian Pacific and National. They operate in the United States also, but that would have been outside the scope of this.
Since you have seen you have been a rail enthusiast in India and you are now a rail enthusiast in Canada, what advice would you like to give to the rail enthusiast in India?
Well, this is the opinion that I held even before I came to Canada, and I would stress upon no preservation or heritage operation can succeed without volunteer participation by members of public. I think there's a huge misunderstanding in India that preservation is something that has to be done by Indian Railways, and they are responsible for it. But that's not the truth. It's a heritage that's shared by all of us, and we are all responsible for it. Indian Railways' job is to operate the trains, and obviously they can provide us as much support as possible, but that's not their primary role, nor should it be expected.
Is this roundhouse, the museum, supported by the, let's say, the railway, or is it a purely private enterprise?
So it's fully funded by the city of Toronto. It's run by Toronto Railway Historical Association, who were the founders. They're a volunteer group, not for profit, and a lot of funding comes from private donors and supporters as well. So as I said, as you can see in this last image, the roundhouse is only in the middle portion. The museum is only in the middle portion of the roundhouse, and there are two tenants, and they support a lot of activities around the museum. Also, anytime a special project is undertaken, a restoration, a movement of a locomotive, that's usually private money. But the day-to-day funding and operation is done by City of Toronto.
Okay. But is the museum self-sustaining now?
The museum is free for entry, so there's no
Okay.
question of profit or loss. It's
Okay.
it's only the miniature railway that charges the ticket when it's in operation during summer. So I would say it's subsidized by the City of Toronto.
I would have imagined there would be more steam locomotives. There appears to be only one.
Well, that's partly because this is one of the latest museums. It didn't come about till 10, 12 years ago. And by that time, most steam locomotives were either gone to other museums or they were restored. So only the diesel locomotives that you see, they were always stored within the roundhouse, and that's how they survived. The steam locomotives was stored elsewhere and was brought here. My hope, and I believe it's shared by the Toronto Railway Historical Association, is over the period of time, if we get more exhibits, not necessarily steam locomotives, the museum can take over further stalls in the roundhouse, and eventually become bigger. Now, in a country like North America, there's not many steam locomotives lying around, but there are some railway relics in private collection, which people donate from time to time. So it's my hope that the museum will expand and maybe one day even take over the entire roundhouse.
Vardhan, thank you very much, Harsh. It was a pleasure having you giving this presentation, and thank you for agreeing to give this presentation. What would be the time in Canada now, in Toronto?
It's entirely my pleasure, sir. It's about 7:20 in the morning, not too early.
Not too bad. Not too bad.
No, it's only because it's on the
colleague,
weekend, but I make more effort
spoke
to
at about
join
midnight.
future talks. Yeah.
Mr. Matthew Gauthier, he spoke at about midnight.
Yes, I saw him when he began his presentation.
Anyway, thank you very much, and I would like to thank not only the speakers today, but all the participants who were patient enough to remain with us till the very end. So thank you very much, and hope that we will meet again tomorrow. And Harsh, thank you very much once again. We will certainly remain in touch.
Thank you, Mr. Singh. It was my pleasure, and thank you, everyone. Even if I cannot see you or hear your voices, to all my friends who are been part of the railway movement in India. I see Apu now. Nice to see you.
कैसे दादा? Yeah.
बहुत बढ़िया आपने.
Fantastic. Yeah. अच्छा.
Yeah,
Thank
good
you very
to see
much.
you
I
all.
look forward.
तो उधर कुछ काका वाका पटाया कि नहीं? हर्ष कुछ फूड प्लेटिंग वगैरह किया कि नहीं किया? क्या मजाक किया कि हाँ? कनाडा में
Yeah,
अपना
preserved
कुछ
railways. It's possible. You can certainly do foot plating on preserved railways, and I like to. There's a lot of preserved railway operation in the United States, not so much in Canada here, and I like to visit a few every year. You can arrange foot plating, and as you know, steam is my bigger interest.
Yeah.
But how many operational steam locals will be there in Canada?
There would be about 24 steam locomotives operational with different private railways, preserved railway societies. A lot more in United States. When you visit, I'll give you a list. So whichever are closer to you, maybe we can plan to go together at some time.
I've thought about coming to Canada, but 3 years back. But then COVID came along, and I didn't go to the US either.
Yeah, when you go to US, it's not very far. I believe your son is somewhere in Northeast.
Unfortunately, he's in Seattle, which is nearer to Vancouver, not near Toronto.
I'm going to Seattle to do a train journey from Vancouver to Jasper in summer with some of other rail fans who were based in North America. So we do these journeys from time to time. One just needs an excuse, I believe.
Yeah, what I've liked about the USA, and perhaps it's true for Canada also, that every place you go to, even the smallest town, will have a small rail gallery, if not a museum.
Yes, a lot of railway stations which are no longer in use because, as Canadian Pacific and Canadian National or CN and CP Rail, they are mostly freight operations. But they have still restored the railway station wherever they have remained, and they are in beautiful condition. There's actually a book I have. It's called "The Trains Don't Go There Anymore," and it's just about the stations which are not been in use, been discontinued operation. But they're beautiful buildings restored.
I think it was in Roanoke in Virginia that I found that there's a rail museum along the rail track along the road. I mean, a thing like that we can never imagine in India. I mean, in the open along the road, they've got different artifacts lying, and it's an open rail museum.
Yeah, I would say North Americans are not as evolved as perhaps Europeans and Britishers in preserving. But in the last 20 years, I have seen a lot of good changes, and there are full-size steam locomotives being built from scratch in North America, which is very promising. A Mallet was restored a couple of years ago. It's a huge locomotive in Cumberland, not far from where I am, near Washington, D.C. These are all very, very encouraging things. And once something is done, it doesn't go back. Like I'd say, unfortunately, in India, things that has happened to fall through cracks or go back after good things have been done. It doesn't happen here. There's always enough volunteer effort or state participation to make sure
that's what we lack in
going.
India. It's difficult to find volunteers in India. There'll be a lot of people who are passionate, who have lots of ideas, but actually volunteering and getting down to doing something, that is not too common.
Yes and no, I would say. The common people, they complain that they don't have the opportunity or they're not involved. It goes both ways. So I've been too far away to comment on that. If I was there, I would have found an opportunity. I wouldn't make an excuse for sure.
Anyway, I think, as I said, all good things do come to an end. So now we come to the end of the day's proceedings today. And thank you very much once again. And thanks again to all speakers today and all participants. We meet tomorrow again at 11 a.m. Indian Standard Time.
Okay. Thank you.
Right now, good evening and good night. And see you tomorrow at 11 a.m.